Hey, thanks for that quick reset. Super excited. I think that last panel honestly really teed up where this conversation is going to totally go. So thanks. We're here to get more deep into the alternative protein world. Mostly going to maybe talk about some cultivated meat, a little plant-based, and just where the technologies are and where they're going. So thank you all for being here. Okay. So, Natalie, Dr. Natalie, I would love to start off with you because I think your work has spanned so much of what's happening in the cultivated meat space. You're at Tufts, but you're also at this private company. And so could you speak a little bit about your work and then also kind of give us an overview of really where cultivated meat is today?
Yeah, for sure. So I graduated from Tufts University late last year with my PhD in basically cultured meat research, technically biomedical engineering, and now I work at a startup called ARC Biotech, and ARC is focused on building bioreactors for the cultivated meat space. But at Tufts, I basically started in a tissue engineering lab that was using tissue engineering for medical applications, so building little human tissues for disease models or future implants, and came in and used those techniques to focus on food. And I ended up at Tufts because it was the only place to really work on cultured meat back in 2016 when there were only a handful of companies, and I just really wanted to, get hands-on experience with the research. And over the past 5 years, as we've all seen, the space has just exploded, and there's so many initiatives and people working in the space now. So it was amazing to watch, kind of incubated in academia and watching the field just expand. My specific research project was on using insect cells for cultured meat, which maybe we can dive into later, the reasons behind that. But we also just worked on a lot of outreach, building courses, just trying to get funding, bring funding into this space. We just wrote so many grants applications and finally had money come in the later years from the USDA. And so where cultured meat is today, still not on shelves, but just so much more support now. And I think getting different players involved. For a long time, it was driven by the tissue engineering community, and we really needed people from meat science and food science and farming and traditional ag and supply chains to enter the field to really bring it to the next level. And I think that's what we're seeing.
Right, there's been billions in funding. Singapore, Qatar governments have invested very significantly. The panel earlier was talking about how there's still an estimate that $1 trillion is needed to really commercialize this. So it's still so much money that's needed. So we'll get into that a bit more. But thank you for that. And Lejjy, I would love to hear, can you tell us a bit about your work and what's been the most important development you've seen just in this past, little while?
Yes, thank you. I'm Lejjy Gafour. So I'm president of Cult Food Science, which is a publicly traded investment and technology development platform focused exclusively on cultivated meat and precision fermentation. But before that, I was a founder of a startup involved in the space, focused on growth media and growth factor development, so making the food for cells cheaper. And I actually also grew up on a farm, so I had my hands in the dirt, but I did not ever imagine I would ever work on food again, because I was working on computers at one point. So it's been a very interesting arc. But yeah, we see a lot of new developments in this space. It used to be that there was always another black box that you'd hear about, whether it was access to cell lines, or the cost of growth media, or this and that. But at this point, every time one of those has come up, there has been multiple startups that have come up with a solution. And right now, a big focus is on scale. So a lot of the interesting tech that we're seeing is actually on new, novel bioreactor designs to help companies get from benchtop and smaller pilot factories to global distribution.
Thank you. Yes, I wanted to start with both of you because from what I hear and what my reporting tells me, the bioreactors and the serum, the growth medium, are the two kind of biggest parts, biggest hurdles to get towards real commercialization of these technologies. And so we can dive into it a bit more. But just so everyone knows, the bioreactors, and maybe you could speak to this a little bit, but the bioreactors are also what's used to make vaccines, which is why they're very they're high in demand right now. There's a huge wait list for these startups to get access to bioreactors. The bioreactors have to change their sizes, like most of the sizes to make vaccines are a completely different scale than what's needed to actually make a reasonable amount of meat. So can you speak to like what your company's actually doing like, to make bioreactors accessible to these startups?
Yeah, great question. So something that I learned, at my new company, like Chloe was saying, most of the bioreactors on Earth are dedicated to the pharmaceutical industry. But even so, even if we took every single bioreactor on Earth right now and started using it to crank out meat instead of vaccines, it would not be enough to even make a dent in the meat industry. Like the medical or like vaccines, it's such a high margin, low volume business, and food is the exact opposite, right? So we really need to create brand new infrastructure. We need more bioreactors, they need to be bigger, they need to be less expensive, and then they need to be specialized to create cultured meat and not vaccines, which are just very different products.
Fair enough. JJ, I want to bring you in here. You're not on the cultivated meat side, but can you explain where your work and your firm are trying to fill the gaps?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everybody. My name's Kass, and I work for a company called Nextgen Foods, and we're the makers of a plant-based chicken product called Tyndall, which if you've been at South by all week, you might have seen our food truck or given it a try. But we are really trying to commercialize and scale very fast as a business, and we see that as the gap right now while cultivated meat continues to scale up. So we are only a 2-year-old company. We launched our product a year ago, and from the way we set it up from the beginning, from ingredient sourcing to manufacturing, everything was done in a way to do it scalably and do it quickly. And to some of the themes of this week of we just don't have time, the mission here was let's replace as many animals on people's plates with our product as possible, as quickly as possible.
Thanks. Yes, and we'll get more into all of that, but I really appreciate it and the time. So, Caroline, let's talk about the big picture. Funding for lab-grown meat is at an all-time high. Also, funding for these other companies like JJ's is at an all-time high. Can you explain where the Good Food Institute is leading kind of the funding conversation and where you think the opportunities most are?
Yeah, absolutely. So hi, everyone. I'm Caroline Bushnell. I'm the Vice President of Corporate Engagement with the Good Food Institute. And if anyone's not familiar with the Good Food Institute, we are a nonprofit focused on creating a sustainable, secure, and just protein supply. And we believe alternative proteins are really a critical way of doing that. And so when I talk about alternative proteins, I'm talking about 3 key pillars. So plant-based, like what JJ's company is making, cultivated meat, like they're focused on here, and then also fermentation-derived proteins. And so big picture, right, for the reasons that JJ touched on, it's critical that we scale up the alternative protein industry so it can become the default choice for consumers to address climate, to mitigate the risk of pandemics, and to more efficiently feed more people. And we're seeing, as you pointed to, Chloe, really strong investment coming into the space. So cultivated meat funding was at an all-time high, so was fermentation funding. And when we talk about fermentation, precision fermentation and whole biomass fermentation are kind of the 2 key technologies there, along with traditional fermentation. And there's a lot of exciting stuff happening in that space that will complement what's going on with cultivated meat and plant-based.
So I asked the panel earlier, but I'd like to pose it to this panel too, because I think maybe you guys will have some maybe different opinions. But there's this debate around funding, and obviously $38 billion in subsidies going to meat and dairy. The government's obviously impacting what we're eating there. Some critics of cultivated meat, I think, would not want to see government funding going towards it. But what do you guys think, and where do you see public and private partnerships working together in this area?
I'll just jump in really quick, and I think for the same reasons that governments invest to solve other critical problems, right? That's what they exist to do. So, governments have been investing in clean energy technologies, right? And we can't solve the climate crisis unless we address our food system. So, public investment in alternative proteins and cultivated meat is going to be really critical to doing that and scaling the industry at the needed pace. As you mentioned, right? A lot of funding is still required.
Only 8 years left,
Yeah.
pretty much.
So we can actually make this a solution that can displace conventionally produced meat.
Yeah, and it's part of our thesis at Cult. It's like capital can behave kind of weirdly, but as these companies start to release products over the next few years, even small releases, even when it's tastings or just maybe even one restaurant, no matter where you live, that increases the interest and increases the amount of funding available. So we made the choice to try to get in early because of the potential in this. But as more products come out, I believe that more funding will come both from the private sector and from the public sector.
Yeah. I'm so impressed with like how far we've come, given like the scarce funding that we had. Like thinking back, like New Harvest, the nonprofit, similar to GFI, focused on this space. They work specifically for cellular agriculture. I would not have been able to study cultured meat without their funding. Like, you can't just go to graduate school and study whatever you want. Like, you have to be tied to a grant. And there's no way I would have been able to do any of that research without New Harvest and GFI, like, basically raising money from individual donors who are passionate about this. Like, there was just no other money at the time to fund that research. So exciting that like we were able to do so much with the limited funding up until this point. So I just can't even imagine like how quickly we'll be able to progress once the dollars actually start rolling in on a larger scale.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I agree with everyone here that both are absolutely critical. We are a venture-backed company, but the majority of our funding has come from Temasek, which is the government of Singapore's venture fund. And we made news as the largest plant-based Series A round ever a couple weeks ago. So that was really big, and I think headlines like that just continue to bring this industry forward. People see that this is the future, that we need to be investing in this, and food is our most critical resource, and governments need to be behind it, as well as the private sector.
So, also, how big was it?
$100 million.
Okay, cool. So yes, massive Series A round. That is probably like, that means the valuation's way more multiples than that. And you're probably what, like barely pre-revenue or just barely having revenue? I think so you're a revenue.
Yeah, we have revenue. So we launched the product a year ago, and we launched internationally. So we launched in Southeast Asia. Our business model right now is selling into food service. And then we launched in the US just 3 weeks ago. But now we're in over, I think, 40 cities at this point,
Wow.
selling our product. And then the plan is to launch in retail very soon. So we're just scaling very fast. But we certainly have revenue from those restaurant sales.
Well, definitely one to watch. Super exciting. I wanted to bring up the regulatory question, though, and just the public funding question, because I think so many of the companies that are getting this funding are private. They're patented. Their intellectual property it's a serious question. And how do you guys think through the intellectual property question? I mean, I think there are some people who would really say that is the entire next wave of meat production and food production really getting privatized around a few handful of individuals? And obviously there's also public research, but maybe you can all speak to that. And
Yeah, I can jump in because we think a lot about what actually needs to be open sourced. Because we have more than one company in a portfolio. We have many. And they actually might have a solution that one of them needs, and they just might not even know about it. So trying to identify what actually needs to be open source and available, whether that comes through academic research or a company willing to put that forward, is really important for the industry to succeed. But it can be at odds with what needs to happen from an investment perspective. So there's definitely lots of opportunities to make that better.
Yeah, and I appreciate you bringing up open source. We can get into that more, but obviously, Cell has had a really long history of open source for 20 plus years, and then it's kind of gotten privatized kind of a little quickly in the past 2. feel free to jump in.
Sure. Yeah, I can build on that a little bit. I think one of the things that GFI is trying to do is to help open source a lot of the foundational science for cultivated meat and some of these other alternative protein technologies to kind of, lift all boats and ensure that not each company is working behind the scenes to try and solve all of the same challenges, where we can help raise that foundation, right, to benefit all of the companies and accelerate the industry quicker.
Yeah, just kind of sticking with that. I mean, I think that's also, I guess, the question of, as these technologies scale, will they be able to have the customer base? I mean, this is taking a lot of money, right? We maybe need as much as $1 trillion to actually get these things off the ground. And I wonder, and I can, maybe some people on this panel could speak to it, are there a lot of startups that are doing similar work right now? I hear about that from time to time, especially from investors who say they're startups that aren't talking to each other and recreating the same work. And at some point, that's also kind of a waste of time and money.
Yeah, that's why I get really excited about enabling technology companies. And while I was in academia, I just grew to really appreciate the collaborative spirit and being able to talk openly about my research and really build off what other people were doing. And so when I moved to the private sector, I knew I wanted to work for a company that was enabling the entire field and focused on one aspect of the solution, and then could really be pretty open about what we're doing, because we need to do that to be able to help and provide the right solutions. So I think as companies specialize, there'll be less duplicated efforts. Right now, if you just were to start a brand new cultured meat company, you have to find where you're going to get cells and do that whole process yourself. But if we have companies providing the cells and just more pick and shovel companies, really, then there'll be less duplicated efforts, is what I think.
And I can build on that from the plant-based side, which is we learned so much from every company that came before us. I mean, we are only a 2-year-old business, and Beyond and Impossible been around for many more years than that. And things that they did helped us to develop our systems and our scale. So even though I think on the private company side, there's a lot that is still proprietary in terms of your ingredients and the custom technology you're using, but we are still using co-manufacturing. We are still sourcing ingredients from a lot of the same places and learning about that supply chain and process.
Thanks, I appreciate that. Let's talk more about the manufacturing. We also spoke about this a little bit on the other panel, and maybe we can get more to the bioreactor side of things too. But what type of manufacturing is needed for these technologies to scale? We were talking earlier about how local processing for some the crickets and other kind of more whole and foods really is necessary on a more regional level. How does it work for cultivated meat? And maybe can you just kick off with bioreactors and talking more about what that work actually is like?
Yeah, exactly. So we're always building off of the existing systems that are out there for pharma. So we know that a bioreactor, it's there to basically replace the functionality of the animal, to keep the cells warm, to get the media circulated. And so that's very similar to what pharma bioreactor needs are. But then there's another element, because we're not just creating cells, we're creating tissues. So we also do need to be innovating completely new designs that are able to actually create structured tissues and not just a mass of cells. So there's brand new innovation, but we have a really good starting point. But I think it really gets into just the need for scale that's not there, and building industries to support the main industry.
Cool. Feel free to hop in, anyone. Lejjy?
Yeah, I can talk about the growth media side for scaling as my previous company.
And maybe when you do that, could you explain, where in the process growth medium is used and how it's used? It's part of what goes into the bioreactor, right?
Yes. Apologies to any scientists in the audience, because I'm generalizing. But yeah, I like to think about it the same way that a cow needs to eat grass. If you're taking their cells to grow food out of them, they still need energy. And since it's separate from the cow, you still need to feed it. And that's where growth media comes in, kind of thinking about it for the food that you need to feed the cells. And there's a lot of different parts to it. And some of it is really, really, really expensive. And there was issues with old formats of growth media, so you hear about FBS or fetal bovine serum a lot.
Can you explain to us like why that was controversial in the first place?
Yes, it is basically a blood-based product from unborn cattle. It is centrifuged out and purified, but it's been in use in medical and tissue research for a very long time, and it has its own magical sauce that cells happen to enjoy. But the big problem is that, it was $400 a liter, which doesn't work out very well when you need hundreds of thousands of liters of it to make food. So companies in the growth media space, such as one that I exited, we spent quite a bit of effort in developing novel formats. In this case, we used insects to be able to produce those really expensive components at a scale to be able to solve that cost problem for companies globally. And we started in 2017. We didn't see any others then, but now today, there's multiple companies focusing on that same problem.
Wow. So it's insects that you're using essentially, because I know like when GFI writes about it, sometimes like minerals and nutrients and a little vague. So it's like you guys are using insects and other things?
Well, when you think about like a bioreactor, I'll use the example of like a beer brewery tank, big steel cylinder. Use that to produce a lot of things that you'd need. In our case, we figured out a way to have the insects act as the bioreactors. So we had 1 million tiny bioreactors rather than the big steel ones. So that brought about a lot of huge changes in how sustainable it was, how much we could make, and most of all, the fact that it could make the complex inputs that can be really hard to make with things like E. coli or yeast through that system.
And I'll just add on regarding FBS. I think it's important to note that companies across the industry are committed to coming to market without using FBS in the production.
Some have already announced that they've at least gotten off of their development. I don't think anything has actually been officially approved to use, like none of the things that are actually on sale right now, like in Singapore from eatjust, like that, they're still selling it with their FBS formula because they needed to send it in years ago with the regulatory approval. But I have heard that they now have an alternative, and some of the others do as well.
Yeah, I don't know what every company is, using. I think, that's somewhat proprietary, but I do know they're all working on, and many have announced that they have successfully identified alternatives.
Proprietary, though, just remember. Jay, do you have anything to hop in if you're not?
Yeah, I think just the only thing to note on plant-based is it seems the big debate is more on our end about do you build manufacturing in-house or do you use co-manufacturing? And a lot of that just comes down to the scale and speed with which you can build and how proprietary your technology is. And so we've opted to go completely co-manufacturing right now, and that was so we could scale up really, really quickly. And we're using 9 simple ingredients in that, so the sourcing, we have that all locked down as a reliable supply chain. And we've kept that ingredient list as minimal as possible because we've heard that from consumers is something they want. But that whole process right now is done in a co-manufacturing facility in Europe. And our goal, to your point about local manufacturing, is to eventually move that into markets as we scale. But those systems still need to be built up, and those co-manufacturers still need to be built up.
Fair enough. Okay, so I'd love to hear more from you guys. Like, what I asked this earlier. The genie in the bottle question. If for your work, obviously all of you guys have super different work, super exciting. If you had one thing to ask for, what would it be? Regulatory, business strategy, or otherwise?
Yeah, also I think access to really awesome people with the right skill set to bring on board. Probably you guys experience similar things. Hiring is really hard because there hasn't been time for people to develop those career paths to have the right skill set, and then also just the perspective of how to talk about the technology and how it's different than maybe what they were doing before if they came from traditional food or came from pharma or something like that. So I think that would really catalyze everybody if we could just fill all those open job descriptions with the perfect candidate.
Yeah, very similar to Natalie. I like to think about it in comparison to the software industry, because if you want to learn how to make software, you can just buy a computer and do it in your house. But you can't do that with cultivated meat. You need a lab, you need equipment. So the more accessible that those tools and techniques are to everyone who wants to be involved, regardless of the model, I believe the more the industry will be able to maximize on that.
Fair enough. Cool.
Yeah. Well, for alternative proteins to scale at the necessary pace to meet consumer demand and address the climate crisis, we need to really scale up the industry, and that's going to take a lot of investment, particularly in the cultivated meat space. So I think public funding is most critical to helping the industry grow at the pace that is needed.
Awesome. I would say more transparency on the meat industry. I think if you look at ingredients, processes, funding, subsidies, head-to-head, alternative proteins will win against meat in consumers' minds every day. But today there's a lot of misinformation. We have decades and decades of us learning about meat in different ways. And I think if there was more transparency, the adoption would be a lot faster on the consumer side, which is the magic moment I would hope for.
And I so appreciate you talking about that. My whole book is about meat, and there is so much there, and we could have had the whole panel just talking about that. But I'm glad we're focusing on what's moving forward. I had an Uber driver yesterday tell us that what's going forward is way more important than what you're looking back on, and I really appreciated it. Okay, in these last few minutes, and also if anyone has any questions, honestly, the Food Tank audience is so engaged, so if anyone has any questions, feel free to shoot up your hands. But, otherwise, I think I would just love to hear, like, what's the singular challenge you want to conquer in the next year, and what is also keeping you optimistic moving forward in these last few minutes? Feel free to think about it. Caroline, go on.
I'll start. Yeah. I really want to see as many companies as possible do a product release, regardless of the format. Like, doesn't even mean it needs to be a large release. Just people, whether it's investors or people in places like this, just being able to taste it and feel it and see it and actually understand that it's real. Every time that happens, the level of involvement increases, the level of belief increases globally to help all these things that we're trying to work through. So every company that can release as much as possible, I think is really the biggest challenge and what I hope to see happen in the next year.
Yeah, I'd say, for alternative proteins to become the default choice for consumers, they need to compete with conventional products on just the table stakes of choice, right, which is price, taste, and convenience. So I'd love to see the industry continue to make progress on providing alternative protein products that provide all of the sensory properties that people expect in conventional meat products, and be able to become more affordable, right? So scale is critical there. So progress on all of those metrics will be really important to allowing these products to be the default choice. In cultivated meat specifically, I think seeing regulatory approval in the U.S. could potentially be a landmark we might reach this year, which
Maybe
would
soon,
be,
yeah.
I don't know, I don't have any special knowledge of that, but it is possible, and I think that would be a really big breakthrough. And optimism, I think it's just clear what an incredible solution these can provide, right? We know industrial animal agriculture is responsible for about 15 to 20% of greenhouse gas emissions. So we need to solve for that, and this gives us an opportunity to do so. And I think there's a lot of consumer tailwinds giving momentum to the space.
For sure, and we also didn't even get into all the energy that the cultivated meat space has, but that's also maybe another panel topic for another time. And I will say that I've been asking the FDA. I have no insights either, but I have been told it's soon.
I think if I can just build on what Lejjy said there on the challenge, I think it is the speed to market that we're getting people to try these amazing products that are being created. I think every couple months there's a new product coming out that is even better than the last one, more innovative, more delicious, lower cost, and we just need to be able to scale those up as fast as possible so people can try them and know they're amazing and a good alternative. And what gives me hope, having been here in Texas for the last week and working with some of our launch partners here on the ground, one in particular that if anyone is local to Austin and has not tried, Project Pollo is the name of the company, and they are a vegan fried chicken restaurant. And they launched during COVID. They're about a year old. They now have 14 locations
Wow.
in Texas. And they're launching one every 30 days. Their fried chicken is Tyndall, our product, and it has just been amazing what they've been able to do in a market that is known for meat and barbecue and the scale with which they are growing. And their product is amazing, and it is at a low cost. It's approachable to consumers, and they said something like 70 to 80% of their customers are not vegan or vegetarian.
Wow.
And are coming in to eat their vegan fried chicken, and that gives me so much hope and optimism.
That's amazing. Dr. Natalie, take us home.
Yeah, over this next year, I'm really excited about just like more connection and communication between companies in the space, especially, coming from an enabling tech side. Like, we could build a great bioreactor, but we want to make sure it's super relevant to the companies that are going to use it. So I just want like more collaboration, more communication, like knowing what the true pain points are, because our company and then a lot of the other, B2B companies are just looking to like help people address whatever challenges they have. So if we can get more information about what those are, then these solutions we're building from scratch will be able to, alleviate those.
Amazing. Well, we're out of time, but thank you so much, JJ, Caroline, Lejjy, Natalie, thank you. My name is Chloe Sorvino. I'm the head of food and agriculture coverage at Forbes, and the Food Tank, thank you so much for having us.